Okay, good afternoon to everyone joining us, or good morning, depending on where you are. We are just going to wait a little while for those to join into the live session. If you're watching the recorded session, hello. All right. Okay, we have two joined us. Hello. Feel free to say hi in the comments. All right. So, without further ado, let's start. So, hello and welcome to everyone joining us. This is the latest in SEN Talks speaker series called SEN Explained. So we form partnerships with professionals and lay people and everyone in between to discuss special educational needs and neurodiversity and attempt to move the conversation forward to foster more understanding and empathy in these spaces. So if you aren't familiar with our work at SEN Talk, we are a nonprofit organization based in South London with a mission to improve social and emotional outcomes and promote inclusion for children and young people with SEN and their families. So today we're delighted to have Paul Isaacs with us to discuss autism, death, and loss. So following Paul's talk, there'll be a question and answer session for about 10 to 15 minutes, however long we deem it appropriate. So feel free to ask questions at any point during the webinar by typing in the chat box, which should be to the right of your screen. A recording of the webinar will be made available to
I think there was a bit of lagging before I was introduced. So is it okay if the slides could be shared, please? So I think there was a bit of interference before my introduction. There we go. Hang on. So is it okay if I could have my presentation, please? I don't know. She's trying to connect.
Paul.
Hello?
Sorry.
Yeah, there's a bad connection.
Hi there, everyone. Is that a better connection?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. I'm so sorry for that little technical bit. Okay. So what I'll do is just finish that intro. I don't know what we heard whether it be useful to start from a certain point. But I will just kind of go through it again. My apologies again. Hopefully it'll be more consistent now. So hi everyone and welcome. Like I was saying before, my name is Valenza, and today's another sort of episode or edition of our speaker series, which is called SEN Explained. So the goal of the speaker series is to discuss special educational needs and neurodiversity and attempt to move the conversation forward to foster more understanding and empathy in these spaces. So SEN Talk, we are a nonprofit organization based in South London with an aim to promote better social and emotional outcomes and promote inclusion for children and young people with special educational needs and their families. So I don't know what I've said already, but we're delighted to have Paul with us to discuss autism, death, and loss. So following Paul's talk, there'll be a question and answer session. So feel free to ask questions at any point during the webinar by typing in the chat box to the right of your screen. A recording of the webinar will be made available on YouTube as it's being streamed live now, immediately after the live session ends today. So to introduce Paul Isaacs, he's an autism training consultant, a speaker and author. He has released and published 5 books on the subject of autism and has contributed to many more. Having overcome many challenges to achieve the success he now enjoys, Paul's message is that autism is a complex mix of ability and disability. He firmly believes that every autistic person should have the opportunity to reach their potential and be regarded as a valued member of society. So with that and the technical difficulties, I'll now turn it over to you, Paul. Thank you so much for being with us and welcome.
Thank you. And now the slides.
Yeah. All right.
Right, so there we go. Am I ready to go? Yeah, I can see it. So this presentation is going to be obviously through the introduction, autism, death and loss. And in this presentation, I'm going to break down some of the information processing aspects of autism, which include alexithymia, language processing disorders, social emotional agnosia, visual verbal agnosia, sensory perceptual challenges, and mentalising. So that's what we're going to be talking about today in the context of the slide and sorry, not in the context of the slide, but in the context of grief, death, and loss. So the first aspect is alexithymia. To give some background on that condition, it has around an 80% correlation with people on the autism spectrum. And what can happen is that the person may get misconstrued as having a lack of empathy or a lack of emotion. But actually, alexithymia by definition is to do with delays in emotional states and delays in emotional self-awareness. So are we in effect looking at monotrack systems that are working more parallel with one another rather than intertwining? That's just a very simplified example of what I'm trying to say. So when we think of the process of death or losing someone, the act of losing someone, the physical sense of loss, the emotional sense of loss, is the origin point. And then in between that time, to varying different degrees, you have processing, which is in expansion what all human beings go through when someone passes away. But in the context of autism, this could be complicated or made more complex by the information processing challenges that present. So I'm going to give a few tangible examples. I just want to say a disclaimer, really, that these examples are from either an observational or personal perspective rather than a representation of the whole autism spectrum. So these delays can manifest a long time after the event has happened. So I can remember going, this is many years ago, to my great aunt's funeral. So obviously all the contextual elements are there that the person has passed. And the way alexithymia works potentially for someone is, if you imagine a bucket in the corner of the room and the bucket is slowly dripping, and the bucket can represent two things. Firstly, the bucket is representing the existential feeling that some people with alexithymia have with their emotional states. So that's the first aspect. The next aspect is the dripping. The dripping is a representation of the delayed and slowness of the processing time. So what you have is two aspects there: the existential nature of alexithymia, which can affect people in very different ways, and also the slowness in time to actually process how that person feels about this current situation. So 6 months after she passed, I remember coming down into the sitting room and just sat down, and this wave of emotion came over me. Now that wasn't to do with me holding things in. That wasn't me ignoring the emotions. What was happening there was a tsunami of raw emotion, which I couldn't handle. And just to say, when I was younger, the way I used to deal with this was through hitting oneself, because the emotional dysregulation was so acute that the disparity between the feeling and how it affected my nervous system and my body meant that I used to tense my head so the temples would strain, and I would also smack my arms and legs as a kind of way of trying to fight off the impending tsunami of the emotional states. So that took around half a year to get that recognition, that understanding, that internalized reason. All the things I experienced that day were coming into fruition very, very slowly. So what this presents is a dilemma, doesn't it? Because if someone does go to a funeral, or actually witnesses or is around the deathbed, a person of significance dying, which also happened to me, that could be sadly misconstrued as they're not feeling anything. But what I'm trying to challenge through this example, and the word alexithymia, it's a condition, is that it's actually to do potentially with a delay in self-emotional states. So we go into language processing challenges. And again, language is how you explain, how you extract, how you bond, how you connect. So if people have varying levels of meaning deafness, which can range from something that could be called residual, so say like 20-30% meaning deaf, to something more complicated, more complex, so 80%. And that's got to be taken into account, because the language that is going to be used then has to be internalized. And whatever language you're using at the time can be internalized in a way which the person understands. So in many ways, what one has to do is take a step back and think about how language has an impact on someone with a language processing disorder. So if I go back to my infancy, sort of 2-3 years old, I was about 80% meaning deaf. So if someone was to explain to me at that time about someone passing away, someone dying, or even going to a funeral, obviously my age has to be taken into account there, because obviously I'm talking about myself in the past tense. But is it also, from a reflective point of view, have you noticed that I have said nothing about lack of intelligence? And that's one of the key points here. Meaning deafness, higher levels of meaning deafness do and can get misconstrued as someone having an inability to cognitively access what's going on, when actually it's to do with language, their ability to filter language. And wouldn't the audience agree that language is crucial in this context anyway, of building bridges of understanding, potential interpretation? So it may be that you have to break down your language. It may be that you have to reform your language. It may be that you have to use what would be called telegraphic, gestural communication, where you're actually using lots of gesture and association through gesture. So you're building a framework of words through movement and gesture and almost mime. It could be that you use a mixture of that and also objects of reference. So what you're doing is you're actually externally mentalizing. You're actually putting different objects as reference points for different aspects of what you're trying to say, and then trying to marry them up. Also, language around deaf and loss is cultural. So we're going into the cultural aspects of language, passing away, um, one going to heaven, they're not around anymore, etc. There are some nuances to language, so to soften the blow of the reality of what's happened. So how does the person internalize that? It's in effect about connected extraction. So what you're trying to say in your own mind and how the person interprets it can be vastly different. So it's about being mindful of these processing challenges, and also being mindful of where they are in terms of language processing. Again, I'm not going to talk about cognition or lack of intelligence. One must presume competence. It's an ethos that I have, regardless of presentation. So you actually, in effect, what you're doing through all these different pieces I'm talking about today is working with their system. So you've got language in terms of use of, extraction, but you also got to be diligent and thinking about how is that going to be internalized so the person gets a connected extraction. And that can be difficult. Some of these things aren't easy. Social motor agnosia tends to affect people more who've had a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. I know that's removed in the USA, and it's potentially going to be removed here with the diagnostic manuals changing. In effect, what social emotional agnosia is, in terms of processing, is to do with social perception. And if you can imagine a world in which you do not process faces, body language, or tone of voice. So you take those aspects away. All the person has left in terms of information, in terms of including social information, which goes on to the next point, it is facts. And that could be construed by people with this diagnosis or have this within their autism profile are more akin to be literal and have literal understanding. That's very different from someone who's meaning deaf, which I was on the previous slide, where they have different levels of language retrieval, but they're not literal. So there's this stereotype that all people on the autism spectrum are literal. No, that's not true. There's different profiles. You can't have you can't make a blanket statement like that. It's very, even if it's well-meaning, it's rather misleading. So you take those elements away, and what that could mean is that they may need a more structured way of filtering information. So to access emotional states, and I'm going to give an example from the other side, just to weigh this up, and it's actually a very good example of the difficulties in perceiving what people are thinking, and the difficulties with perception at that moment in time, and how strategies were put in place to build bridges of understanding. Now, my mother lost her father in 2017, and it was a great loss indeed for her, in terms of the connection she had with him, the length of time he'd lived. And my father has a diagnosis of Asperger's, and the example I'm going to give is it speaks for itself and what helped. So she was upstairs weeping on the bed, and my father come into the room, and his focus was to clean the room, dust the room, and that's exactly what he was doing. So bearing in mind what I've said about social emotional agnosia, it's someone who cannot perceive, the eyes work, but it's all about perception. Cannot perceive body language, facial expression, or tone of voice. So she was crying about the loss of her dad, and he dusted the room and looked at mum and went out and continued to clean the house. My mother was then distressed for two reasons. Firstly, because of the grief, but she come downstairs and said, Peter, that's my father's name, has completely ignored me up in the room. It's he just doesn't seem to recognize what's going on. And she explained to me what happened, which I've explained to you, the audience, from her perspective partly. And I said, I think I know what's going on here. So what I said to her was, because of the way he perceives information, it's not a lack of empathy, it's the inability to access. So I said, if you go back upstairs and you factually, structurally, almost in a list-like fashion, tell Dad how you feel at this moment. I feel, Peter, I feel like this and like this and like this. And she did do that. And with that knowledge that was displayed to him through the way in which I suggested, connections were made and then empathy was shown. So this can be misconstrued as a lack of empathy again, because the person doesn't seem, and I emphasize doesn't seem, because that isn't the reality, to connect with what's going on. But if one actually works again with their system, understands their system, understands the different mechanics of their system, then you can actually build bridges of understanding. So his awareness of my mother's grief was there, but sometimes in that context, he has to be told this is what's happening now. He's got an overview of what is going on, but he needed help. And when that help was given, the ability to connect was there. So visual verbal agnosia. I don't know what's happened with my slides, but there we go. May struggle with written information. So if we think about writing, we think about reading, we think about text. I can remember working with a man many years ago at a specialist school. And what happened with him, I can remember giving him long reams of text, and he would echolately speak the words out that were being written, but there were delays in the filtering of the information. So the phonics was there, the sounds were there, but there were big chunks of context that weren't. And this is all to do with information processing. So may struggle to create a connection between what is being written, the semantics, and then how they feel. This is where I go back to those monotrack systems. So again, it's about filtering. What could be looked at with people that struggle with books, struggle with reading, where they get distressed by books. I've seen people who show great distress by books to the point where they're ripping pages off books, eating pages of information, who post books, magazines, etc. Because there's something about this inability to filter that can be potentially quite distressing. So you may have to take a novel approach to explain about death, loss, and grief, objects of reference. If they've got a visual memory, you may use photographic reference points about the family member, for example. But if they're objects and the person isn't a visual thinker, you could get something like their shoes, a cardigan. I can remember with my gramp, one of the things I kept and have kept is his hat and his gloves, because they smell of Gramp, and and I notice actually in the hat, which is for me quite significant because he wore it a lot. There's still his white hairs in the hat. There's literally pieces of him um, in the hat. And again, what you're doing is you're trying to find bridges and abilities to connect. So bridges are looking at what the processing challenges are and trying to connect. All these information processing challenges are about firstly understanding what each one is and then actually finding bridges of connection. So visual verbal agnosia is to do with comprehension blindness of the written word. And it's about with each challenge comes strategies. So the next slide. So sensory perceptual challenges. What if someone is living before awareness mind, where they see things in bits because of visual perceptual challenges, sensory perceptual challenges. So if they see things in bits and are meaning and or face blind, the visual perceptual world is quite, could be potentially quite kaleidoscopic. And that may mean, because of those, again, it goes down to filtering information because of those blockages, having a kinesthetic and associative learning style may be the way to access information. And I can remember some time ago, speaking about a friend's son when her father died. what her son done in the graveyard was actually it looked like he was digging mini graves, as she put it. But if you think about what's going on and the associations being made, um, if you think about the act of what he was doing with the earth, digging up the earth, uh, actually there's a connection going on there, when we think about the actual system I'm talking about. It's before awareness mind. So we have the conscious mind, the mind of ego, which is all aware, all encompassing, and everything has uh, existential created structures that we human beings impose on the world. Some of them are really grand. So let's just give a quick example. Um, Buses and bus timetables and trains and train stations, etc. That's a way in which you create patterns through association. But if someone's living in the system of sensing, before cladding, before hierarchy, one can pick up on energy, move through people. Being a baby, developmentally, is where the system sensing resides, where your nervous system is raw. So sensing is before interpretation, effectively. That's what I'm saying. So for this young man, um, just actually processing what's going on an unconscious level and garnering pieces of information through association has nothing to do with a lack of intelligence. It's to do with information processing. So maybe it is that people need to touch, taste, sound, use sound, smell, or movement to actually garner and get meaning from the world around them. So picking up some of the examples I said in the previous slide, it could be about looking at objects of association with the person who's passed. It could be about maybe having a sensory box with hair or perfume, or a favorite, or something they wore of significance, or something that represented them, maybe their work or their leisurely activities. For example, I used uh, the memory of my grant was his hat, and it's a hat he wore a lot. He wore it when he was cold. He also loved gardening, and he would go out gardening, and go on his travels in winter with the hat. So there's a strong significance there. And again, what we're doing is we're trying to find and understand what the information processing challenges are, and what connections we can find and use, and essentially work parallel with the person's system. That's what you're trying to do. And through that, hopefully, it is trial and error, that you actually build up meaningful connections and also opportunities. I think, as we're closing this presentation, that people should be given, and I'm sure the audience will agree, the opportunity to face death, loss, and grief in a way which is tangible and meaningful to them. I know there's cultural issues in the United Kingdom, which I disagree with, around not talking about this topic enough, and almost, from a philosophical point of view, not actually talk. If one is not talking about it enough, it's either that or not talking about it in a way which is real. And I think that is why culturally, unless you've got a household that has faced it or has a more balanced view of what's going on, to face death in a more positive, balanced way. There is such a thing as a good death. My nan had that, and there is such a thing as healthily understanding that you will not be here forever. So maybe there has to be a cultural shift in the way we view death of other people, and also the fragility of our own mortality when we eventually have to face ours. I hope you've enjoyed this. I will go on to the next few slides, which are basically about if you want to have me speak. Now, obviously, I don't just talk about this subject. There are many other subjects I can talk about. I'm just looking through it as because I shared this so much. Education, mental health, which is partly what I've been speaking about today. Sensory issues, language processing, life skills, employment, mindfulness, etc. So that just gives you a basic overview. And I hope you've enjoyed my speech. If you do have inquiries or want to leave feedback for my site, please email me at stayperth12@yahoo.co.uk. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and now I will go on to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. What an insightful presentation. I like the approach of using different information processing as opportunities. I think that's absolutely the approach. And so, with that said, I think we'll lead into a Q&A. So I'll just give everyone a few minutes. I'd like to hear from you. So if you have any, whether you just want to share a comment or your experience, or if you have a particular question for Paul, feel free to add it in. Also, if you'd be interested in hearing more from Paul, if there are particular areas, we can absolutely collaborate on different sort of themes there in discussion. Okay, I think what we'll do, Paul, if you feel okay with that, I think everyone's gotten that email, and so if people do have questions who registered today, is it okay if they send a question over to you?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine if they want to do that. If that's what they'd rather do, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and so what I'll do, Paul sent me the PDF of these slides, so those that have registered to attend, I'll include that in the follow-up. And again, any feedback, any questions, always welcome. Seems like Joy's just saying thank you so much. It was very helpful. All right, thank you, Joy. Okay, so I think we'll end the session here. Thank you for those who attended. Thank you so much, Paul, for your time today.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care, everyone.